Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I am Rachel Fishman-Feddersen. I am the CEO and publisher of The Forward, which you can find every day at forward.com, in your inbox, at live Zoom events. Hello out there in Zoom land. We're so glad you could join us. We are here tonight for a really special event, Bintel Live, with the wonderful hosts of our podcast, Ginna Green and Lynn Harris, speaking with our editor-in-chief, Jodi Rudoren, joined by our inimitable perma-guest, archivist, Chana Pollack, who is outstanding and fabulous. If you did not know, The Forward is alive, well, vibrant, reaching about 1.5 million people a month on the website, on social media, through newsletters, on YouTube. We still publish in Yiddish as well as English. And our podcast, Bintel Brief, this is in its second season, and we are thrilled to have our hosts here. So please come join us. And the last thing I will say is that The Forward is nonprofit and depends on donations from people just like you. So if you would like to talk to me about that, I will be in the back of the room after the event. Have a good time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. And thank you all for coming out to the Marlene Meyerson JCC Manhattan. We love the JCC Manhattan. We've done many events in partnership with them. We have helping us today on our tech team, Matt and Jay. Hello to all of you out there in actually not Zoom land, but Vimeo land. And we will be taking questions both live here in the audience if you have them, and also on Vimeo. You can put your questions in the chat. I am Jodi Rudoren. I'm the editor-in-chief of The Forward, and I would love to tell you about how this podcast came to be, just in very brief, which is one of the first things I thought when I got this job 3 years ago was, how do we reinvent, revive, reignite A Bintel Brief, which is The Forward's historic, I see nods in the room, I'm thrilled, historic advice column. Started in 1906. Chana will tell us more about this later, but basically because people were just writing to The Forward. It played this role in the community, particularly the immigrant community, particularly on the Lower East Side. People just wrote to The Forward about all kinds of things, all kinds of questions, and finally the founding editor said, we should answer some of these in a advice column. This is half a century before Ann Landers and Abby, Dear Abby, and so we are one of the inaugural advice columns that exists. So we decided we should revive it, and how do you revive an advice column in 2020, 2021, 2022? You make it a podcast. And I am just so excited to be here with our hosts, Ginna Green, Lynn Harris, Chana Pollack. I'm not going to do a lengthy formal introduction because obviously being the hosts of Bintel Brief is their most important identity. Yes. We're all felling a little bit. This is the first time any of us have met Ginna in 3 dimensions. We hired Ginna, we created this team in 2020. We thought she was flat, a Zoom square. We didn't know that she had volume.
Yes, I do.
I'm just kidding.
3 dimensions.
So we're just all kind of getting over that, seeing each other in the flesh. It's very exciting. And it's very exciting to see you in the flesh, especially Ed Blank, the sponsor of this podcast, who is here in the room with us at the JCC.
Please stand up.
Please stand up.
Stand up.
Ginna, let's say it.
Yes.
Special thanks to Ed
Edward
Blank,
whose
whose generosity makes this show possible.
Ed Blank, a member of the Forward's board, several years ago said, we got to do more to reach young people. Let's make a podcast. And we did, and here we are. So we are really excited to have you with us, and I think I'm just going to jump right into it. But if you have questions, and I'm talking about like the deep advice question, you need advice from A Bintel Brief, we will take those shortly. But I want to start by asking Ginna and Lynn, we hired you, we engaged you for this podcast because you're good at giving advice, because it's the thing that you've been doing. Lynn wrote an advice column many years ago. Ginna is a person that everybody in all of her circles always asks for advice. That's why we put you on the pod, but now you've spent a couple years being podcast advice giver. So how has that changed your approach to giving advice? What do you do differently? And has it changed also your perspective at all on seeking advice? Or receiving it, how you receive it and absorb it. Lynn, you said you were excited about this question.
Yeah,
so
I do like this question. First of all, thank you, Jodi. This is also the first time that the four of us have been in this room together. Certainly the first time we've all been with Ed Blank in the same room. So, so we're all very excited. Thank you all for being here. Thanks for organizing. Jodi's right. I had written an advice column of my own making, as well as I had written advice for many magazines of blessed memory. You remember magazines? They're sort of like books, but they're thinner. And I actually, doing this project, actually affirmed one of my beliefs about advice. So rather than changing my mind, it actually made me very deeply believe the following, and that is, people ask, well, how come you give advice? How come you're right? And you could ask that about any advice columnist. And the answer isn't that we're right. I think what working on this project has affirmed for me is that solid advice comes not from one individual being right, but from a set of principles. And giving advice from those set of principles. So for example, you could be writing advice from a perspective, for a publication or venue where that's about personal wellness. So if someone asks you, how can I get more sleep? You can talk about how they can get more sleep. And those are the principles that you come from. Whereas if you're answering that same question, writing advice in a social justice venue, you could say, well, you could advocate for, better support for families to not work around the clock and actually have childcare and a system that makes it possible for families to get some sleep. So and both of those are good sets of advice, but you're coming from a different set of principles. So in this case, we got the opportunity to think, well, what would be good for the Jews, or what might be a Jewish perspective? So we weren't more right than other people. We just had an interesting framework to come from, and that really affirmed my idea that we're not righter, more right than the rest of you necessarily. But when you bring rigor and a set of consistent principles, you could probably give some pretty good advice.
How do I get more sleep? Shabbat.
There's that, yes. And Shabbat, exactly.
Gina, what about you? This is your first official professional advice-giving role.
Correct.
Does it change your approach to when
Correct.
people ask for advice?
I agree with Lynn in the sense that there are principles that guide the process of giving advice, but I think at the core is the questions that we ask in the course of that process, which is another reason I think this is a very Jewish podcast, is because we ask so many questions. We sort of read between the lines of the inquiry that we're getting. We're trying to figure out what's at play, who are the actors, who are the players, what do people want to be the outcome, what do they want their lives to be, what do they want to have happen as a result of getting advice from us.
One of the things that I think is so hard about doing an advice column or an advice podcast, and it's even harder for your role, Chana, looking at the history, is you guys are almost always, you're like, well, I have a bunch of questions for there's a bunch of stuff that's not there. And when you're talking to your friend, you ask them those questions, who's come to you for, but you guys have this text that somebody has submitted, and you often have you try to read between the lines. And Chana, you're looking back 10, 20, 50, 100 years to try to say, what else was going on with this person? So I wonder how you think about what those gaps mean, and what you do with the gaps when you can't get more information, more context.
Well, historically, lucky for me, Ab Khan answered a lot of these over,
Founding editor of the Forward.
Right, the founding editor of the Forward, over the decades. So, his stylistics is sometimes what I draw from, as opposed to what he actually said, but just the tone, the style. And a lot of times he too had to read between the lines. And a lot of times he was, kind of curt and very short. And whoever else, he had assigned to edit the column, because it went through, several people. So I think I draw from that too, that there's only so much you can know. There are several times that they actually answered people well, there's only so much we can tell from what you've written to us.
Yeah.
And so we tell you, seek out a financial advisor, or seek out a lawyer, or, right? So there's a pivot that they would do. So I think I draw from that as well. I don't feel burdened that I have to actually,
Chana's, of course, reading those old letters in Yiddish and translating them. And one of my favorite parts of the show, I think you guys like this too, is when you tell us about the specific Yiddish term used and what inferences you're drawing from those choices about which word. So I think it helps you read between the lines almost that you're doing that translation, right? Or maybe that's only because you're talking about it.
No, yes, definitely. You know, I was just looking back and I was looking at one that I think we may have used from 1906, where a woman wrote in to say that she was very distressed about the fact of her husband was, you know, in Yiddish they use the term drehen sich herum, and I think I just went for catting around. You know, so, you know, because that was the tone of the letter. So I thought that was a good leap, you know, and also I think we try to bring it into contemporary context, right? Like not to be too literal about it, but just to see like, what's the big picture here?
Yeah. And also I think Chana's gift is that sometimes the question that she's bringing in from the archives might seem and look super similar on the surface to the question that we're answering in 2022 or 2021. And other times it might be thematically similar, but not contextually similar, like circumstantially similar. And so I think that, Chana, thank you, because I think that is such a tremendous gift that we get such a wide range of types of
I want to get
connections
into
to the
that
modern
because
question.
so for those who are new to Bintel Brief, and you can find it on all of your regular podcast platforms or on the Forward's website to go listen back to the episodes. We have our last episode of season 2 coming out next week, but we've also re-upped on the podcast platform a number of episodes that are particularly relevant to the high holiday season. So you can binge away. But the concept of having modern day hosts and having Chana look back to the archive is to try to figure out how our history speaks to our present and what is in our archive that might be relevant to the modern question that we're dealing with. And I guess what I have been struck with, and you guys can say what you think, but like when we first started with this concept, I think Chana was a little bit maybe skeptical. We were skeptical. Could we actually find the right parallel letters that would be like, oh, they asked about intermarriage in 1924 and again in 1978 and now today? And what I think is I've just been so fascinated by is the connections you all have made between those historic letters and the modern letters that aren't obvious at all. I'm thinking of the one where you found the woman addicted to bingo, and I don't even remember that. So tell us a little bit, Chana, how you figure out which letters to pair with which letters, how you dive in and pick them out.
Right. So I think it's kind of like what I was saying, like thematically, like there's a tone kind of in the writer that's, you know, the modern day writer also has a tone. So sometimes I think it's a question of matching tone and tone. It doesn't have to be, you know, literally the same problem, but the big picture. Like I think I don't remember exactly, but I think the bingo letter was a response to somebody who was, I think, maybe tired of being at home in COVID. Like they were trying to figure out how to have a semblance of like a good family life at home at a time when it was like so difficult. And this was a story in the 1970s in the Forward when bingo was becoming really popular in New York and a lot of churches and then synagogues and people were going out to play bingo. And so this guy wrote in to the Forward talking about his wife who was going out to play bingo all the time and he didn't know how to keep her home or how to, you know, why was she so busy with the bingo? Was she getting like an addiction? Was it gambling? Like what was the problem? And the way he wrote in that also sort of he gave us like what we would call B-roll. He gave like such a delicious description of a New York bingo hall with
Smoky,
the
right?
Smoke-filled
House of
rooms.
ill bingo repute.
And then the amazing thing was what the advice was. You guys wrote the advice was you should read to her, right?
Yeah.
You should, and you just had this image of this husband reading aloud to his wife.
And didn't he like write back and say it worked?
Yeah.
At least in their minds.
But
They
you
all
know,
write
that's
back
a
to
little
say
bit
it
also
worked.
of the history of the Bintel Brief that I think a lot of people grew up hearing it read to them, right? Especially if you were like a generation that didn't necessarily read Yiddish, but the generation before did. That was like a tremendous, like I hear that all the time, people tell us about how the Bintel Brief was sort of transmitted in Jewish families. The one generation was the Yiddish reader, was subscribing to the Forward, and the next generation and the one after that loved to hear the stories, but they didn't necessarily have the Yiddish literacy. So the fact that he talked about in that letter, you know, I'm going to read to you. Like the advice was read to her. I also thought was a little bit of a pitch from the Forward of like, hopefully you're reading the paper too.
Tell Lynn and Ginna, what is the archive tell us about how you interact with these archival letters and kind of what it brings up for you, or how it helps you address the modern letters.
I was just going to say super quick that my dear friend Amy, if you're listening, Amy also said that she read the old A Bintel Brief letters to her mother, to her aging mother in her dotage, and that was one way that they bonded, like recently. How do we relate to them?
I mean, I get really excited because we don't know what letter Chana is going to bring to the podcast. So Lynn and I don't have any idea what letter is going to come from the archive. So that's a complete surprise to us. I'm always like, okay, what's Chana going to bring to us today? I love history, and it feels like this is a snapshot. This is going back for 30 minutes into a moment in time, whether it's 1906 or it's 1976. And that feels really incredible to me, to be able to make that sort of longitudinal connection across lives and people and stories that you make possible and the Forward makes possible with the archives. It's tremendous.
Yeah. I also really respond to the actual writing. I know that I'm not alone in this. I know we all know this, but they're just poetry. They're just, dear esteemed. I can't even do a good impression of it. But I mean, they're like letters home from the Civil War. They're just like poetry in American history that was just written by regular people. Yeah. And I just always respond to, even just like, we cannot stop thinking about the smoke in the bingo parlors. Like, that is just an image that has stayed with me.
The other incredible thing about that tone is the reality of what the Forward was for this particular Jewish community of Ashkenazi immigrants in those eras, that like no news organization really is anymore to anyone. It's just like the proliferation of news sources and the cacophony of social media. The idea of this is an organization where people came to the building to watch the election night returns together, or to get a vaccine or whatever. And it's like this idea of writing to the Bintel Brief, which I should have probably said earlier, is Yiddish for a bundle of letters. Or seeking the counsel of the Forward had a role that I feel like was gone kind of before I was born. It's like really feels like a moment in time that is really special.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that generated sort of that energy and that relationship, I think, to the readership is that I think a lot of people don't realize this, but our historic building down on East Broadway, right? It was open 24/7. So that sort of, it's interesting to think about like what came first. Did they decide to open the building 24/7 because people were just streaming in? Or they were open 24/7 and people knew they could come, and they knew they could come to ask questions. And before they had built their building, they had even, you could send a poste restante, like the Forward functioned as a sort of mailbox for new immigrants who came who didn't have an address. You could have mail sent to you to the building, and you could come to the building and pick it up. So I think there was like a natural sort of progression of the building is open, you can come to the building, you can have your mail sent to the building, and of course there were other organizations in the building, like Jodi was talking about. You could come and get a vaccine because we partnered with the Arbitering, with the Workers' Circle for a long time, and there was a medical clinic in the building. So, it was like a natural progression, but it also answered a deep need at the time.
It's like a whole town. Right. There you can get it's like there's the doctor's office and the mail and the post office and
the sheriff.
The sheriff, exactly.
And advice.
And advice.
So you guys have answered like 20 different questions, plus considered those ones from the archives. And I would love to know what was the hardest one? What was your favorite one? And looking back, is there an answer or a thing you said that you would change now, that you might take back?
You think I'm going to say the hardest one was the one about Israel. That was not the hardest one. The hardest one for me, I think, was arguably the most mundane, but we chose it because it was so relatable. It was from, I think we called it Fear of FOMO, and it was from a woman who just was having trouble. It was pandemic, and she was having trouble finding community and connecting with her friends, and she felt like she wasn't even getting invited to all the Zoom reunions and sort of adaptations that other people had made, and she was lonely. And I think we gave her a pretty good answer. Like, I don't necessarily regret our answer, but I don't know that anyone has ever really nailed that answer. I don't know that join a club, is really what it comes down to, with it's the general advice for that thing. Like, find your people, start walking dogs at the animal shelter. Like, those are fine things to say. They're not wrong, they're not bad. But part of me wonders if we could have gone back and not necessarily finally had the best answer to that question, but actually ask questions about that question. Like, that is an eternal question. And I still don't, like, if we had just sort of opened up the elephant in the room and said, everyone ask this question: how do I meet people? How do I make friends, whether it's the pandemic or not? And there's never been a better answer than join a club. And I think we can do better. And I would like to at least name that and figure out, let's talk about that question. Why is that the eternal question?
Or maybe we can't do better, which is
Maybe
a
we can't.
possibility, but
Right.
ask the question, interrogate
Ask the question. Right.
I've got 2 answers.
Okay.
So Mr. Not Dad
Mr. Not
was
Dad.
from
Our
season
first
1.
First one.
episode.
Yep. And it was about an older gentleman who was lamenting the fact that he hadn't had kids yet.
Not
And
that old. I think he was in his 50s.
I said older.
Literally, he's just
Older than
he's exactly my age.
you're also older than me. Lynn.
That's true.
Okay,
Okay,
let's
I'm
move
just like-
on.
But I look amazing.
So, one of the things, I think our advice was sound.
So wait, he was
But-
in his 50s,
Yeah.
and he was like,
Unattached. and
I don't think I'll ever find a partner. I don't think I'm going to have kids. I'm
Yep.
mourning the family
That I never got
I
to have.
wanted to have, and I don't think I'm ever going to have.
Right. And I think maybe I think we gave good advice, but maybe we didn't actually consider and hold that he is older. It is going to be harder. It actually might not happen. I think we wanted to be uplifting and hopeful, but it is actually possible that he might not get the family that he always wanted. And so I think we might not have entertained that as much because of wanting to say, actually, it is possible. There are options and possibilities, and there's also the chance that you won't get that. This season, Dungeons and Dragons, the Dungeons and Dragons episode. What did we call that one?
I
No
forget.
dice.
And this
No, but we also Dungeons and
Okay, we'll look it up. Anyway, this was an episode in which
Again,
actually
we're old.
we were super excited. A high school student wrote in with this question, a high school senior. I think it was a she, I can't remember. And she wrote she's playing Dungeons and Dragons, which is like a simulation situation game where there's a dungeon master who, I should have let Lynn explain
There's
this,
a
but
quest, yeah.
who kind of sets up scenarios, and you play with a group. And the dungeon master set up a scenario that involved an immigration raid, an ICE raid. This player, this student, was the child of immigrants and found it extremely traumatic and triggering to have this scenario. Told her friend group about it. The friend group, or some members of them, apologized, but she felt the apology was inauthentic. This is actually one of the episodes I've re-upped for the holidays, not because I think Dungeons and Dragons is particularly relevant to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, but because I think this question of what is about apologizing and what's an authentic apology. So,
And it was tough for a few different reasons. One, that's not a joking matter. Like, it's not fun. It's not a scenario. It's not a role-playing exercise when families are being ripped apart. And I get super emotional sometimes, and there might be some tears, but like, it's just to be with people you think are your friends, who then give you an inauthentic apology and then continue to play the game with that scenario that you've already said is offensive and harmful and hurtful. I was like, cut them off. You're young. Find new friends. And you don't want to say that, but in this era, especially me, as a Black Jewish woman who's lived in these last few years and the daughter of the civil rights movement, like, I don't have any time, patience, or tolerance for that.
but one of the interesting things about this question was you guys pretty much disagreed about that. I mean, I may be naming that a little bit more, but you were like, cut them off. And by the way, you're probably leaving high school and going on to your next phase, so don't worry about it so much. And Lynn said, never give up kind of thing. She said 2 things. She kind of said, first of all, not so ready to let go of a relationship as Ginna's saying she is. And the process of confrontation can be a practice for you. I think you had a term for this. It was called, I forget, something about how to deal with conflict, and you suggested that even if you are going to move on from these friends, going back to them and explaining how this apology made you feel would be worthwhile.
Yeah, no, I said at least go out with a bang. At least say, this is why you guys screwed up and I'm out of here. Here's why, goodbye. But not without the opportunity to explain why, not just because.
So let's talk about disagreement. Like,
sure.
How do you guys do you like to disagree, agree? How do you deal with it when you don't agree about what the advice should be or about which questions to pick or whatever? How's that going?
Well,
And can you just get in a fight right now?
I was going to say,
What can we disagree about right now? We'll see.
Awkwardly, I will actually expose that Jodi also actually wants us to disagree a little bit more, I think, and that's entirely fair. That's entirely fair because one of the things we worked on was we did actually work on finding the nuance because we would basically Ginna and I both agree that everyone in the world should treat other people as full human beings, full stop. And so if we're coming to all of the pieces of advice or all of the opportunities for advice from a place of just
That
compassion,
yeah.
just that, then at some basic level, we're going to agree. And so it was an interesting experiment to figure out, okay, got it that we agree there. But in this person's particular life where they have to take particular actions and use particular words and take particular steps to solve a problem, where do we, where do our paths diverge?
Well, and what I found really interesting is it's not so much whether you agree on the advice, it's when you see different things in the question, what the
that's
questions
true.
bring up. And I wonder, Chana, what happens when you think you come on for the second segment and you're like, that advice was stupid, or I disagree.
Well, I have the easiest, like in that respect, I have the easy, it's like the parents and like I'm the kid and it's like, I can do whatever I want. I'm not going to get into it. I'm not on the level of and I also really, really enjoy, I tell them all the time, it feels like I'm in Talmud class. And it really is Ben Bugbug says this.
Chana, by the way, has
Shimon
been
said
to Talmud class. She grew up studying a lot of text.
Yeah, that's high
But it
praise.
just-
Thank you.
No, really, because it's traditional Jewish, and you can read it in the foreword all the time up to this day. Is pilpul, is like argumentation, or there's a famous, I think from the Mishnah, the phrase, how do you study the Torah? You turn it over, you turn it over, you turn it over, you turn it over, and it's kind of that process. And my sense is when I come on, is that I'm actually being received like it's a gift, like the material I bring from the past. They're willing to turn it over and try to find an entry into it because it's not always easy, and it's a process of translation. And I feel like that's what I'm observing too, is how to take this moment in popular culture, like Dungeons and Dragons really threw me for a loop.
I know, I was like, how is she going to find an old letter about Dungeons and Dragons?
I was like, thank you.
Go back to the time of actual dragons.
Writer.
Well, I have a question for you, Chana, which is...
Don't ask me how to say Dungeons and Dragons in Yiddish.
Oh.
That was a missed opportunity.
Next up. Okay.
I just posed that question today, so I owe that back to people.
Okay.
I posed it to the public because I was like,
We'll put it in the next Bintel
Put it
Brief
in the next
newsletter.
Exactly. Sometimes Chana comes to the podcast and is there for the entire time while Lynn and I are turning over the question from today. Sometimes Chana pops in for the last of it. Which do you prefer?
yes. I don't want to sound like a wimp, but I don't really. It's perfect when I'm there for the time. I'm really, really engaged in your process, and that includes the tech stuff too. Because it's a technical process. It's produced. So sometimes you have to repeat, or you have to go back on a line, or you have to. And it's fascinating to me how you hold the question, the whole time. That phrase we say now, holding space. You actually really very beautifully hold space for the controversy, for the question. And it's not so much, in my experience, it's not a chase for the answer. And I think that's what, really what you're pointing out. The Bintel Brief over time was not a chase for the answer. It was the story, the entertainment of the story. It was the Yiddish, definitely. And it was the response is usually this much. The question is given almost half a page sometimes. And that's expensive. Right. That's ink and that's, font and type. And that's a lot of money that the forward invested in.
Because that's what someone's story. That is someone's story. right? The advice isn't the story.
Right. It is the story. It's not the question.
Right,
Or
exactly.
the answer.
I
Exactly.
think you also reminded us that a lot of in many cases, the letters, I guess as we might put it right now, were more of a comment than a question, or at least that people just wrote to say, I just need to say this,
Yes.
or I just need to reach somebody with this, or sort of an elaborate, misconnections, or I just need to tell the world,
Yes.
as opposed to asking a question.
Yes. Yes. And
So, speaking of holding, well, I want to just remind the audience, both here in person at the JCC Manhattan, thank you to our partners, and on Vimeo, that we are going to take your questions, your dilemmas of daily life, probably not the Megillah length ones, maybe a little quick one, in what we call a Bintel Blitz in just a few minutes. So if you're on Vimeo, put them in the chat. If you're here, think them, and we'll call you up to the microphone. But first, so Chana just mentioned about holding space. The space you guys were actually holding as you recorded this podcast, I believe, was a linen closet and some other kind of closet.
Yeah.
Yeah, my laundry room and my husband's closet. Thank you for letting me use your closet.
Thank you, David.
Yeah.
Yes, I was in the linen
Tell us
closet.
about how that is exactly. Like,
Hot, hot, and
Yes.
not in that way. Like just,
Right.
in the summer, I would turn on the air conditioning in our bedroom and then leave the closet door open, and then at the last second, and because we had to create relatively soundproof environments, and as it turned out, the laundry room was not as soundproof as I thought, and also very hot. But I would turn on the air conditioning and just until the last second, and then be like, and then close the door, and then be like, all right, let's go. And kind of wait till, and then it was that when when you're just sitting still and still sweating, and then anytime we had a break, I would open the door and kind of use it as a fan, and then bring it. But and we would sort of, we were all kind of huddled under. We looked like we had built pillow forts, and it's too bad we didn't do them on YouTube also, because
It would have been
it would
entertaining.
have been amazing.
And I had a linen my closet was a linen closet in the middle of the upstairs hallway, so I had no access to a good vent and good AC beforehand. So there was that. But I also had 4 kids who might come home in the middle of the podcast, and so there was always I needed an on-air sign so they'd be quiet before they came thundering up the stairs.
speaking of needing a soundproof room, I want to give a shout out to our amazing partners and producers at Wonder Media Network.
Yes.
Our producer, Ali Wollner, and assistant producer, Carmen Borca Carrillo, in addition to Ed Blank. They literally made this podcast possible and made it so beautiful to listen to. So thank you, Ali and Carmen. It's been a joy to work with you guys. Do I have anyone in the room who needs advice? I do have some pre-prepared questions from our broader audience, so I will go to those. But if any of you,
You can ask for a friend.
if any of you are asking for a friend, my colleague Matt Lippman is coming right up to you with this microphone. We're going to do a Bintel Blitz, give advice live, and this is where I get to also play.
I don't want advice, but I would love to hear some of those old Bintel Briefs from the early 1900s. If you could read some of those.
Fortunately, Chana has memorized all of them.
Well,
would be
I will
fun.
say, and Chana will help me out. But so first of all, if you listen to the podcast, you will hear one on every episode. So please go to your podcast platform and download them there.
In English
Also-
and Yiddish. Chana reads them in both Yiddish and English. It's great.
Also, there have been 2 collections of old Bintels, right? One is really a collection by,
Isaac Metzger.
thank you, and the other is
They're
by
both-
Liana Fink. Is a kind of, well, Liana's is not, and Liana Fink has a modern collection. And is there a third one also?
Metzger actually did 2.
2. So
it
you
went all the way
can
up to
find
date.
those books, but we're not going to make Chana recite from
But I
memory.
can, it kind of, they had me do what are all the subjects that come up all the time?
Oh, yeah.
So just kind of riffing on that, I can tell you, a couple of them. There was definitely one that I love. I was born in Montreal, so maybe that's why I love it. It's called the Montrealer Sisters, and this is in the 20s. Sisters at 2 different times wrote to the Bintel Brief complaining about each other. It's actually a very poignant and classic forward story. One of them had come over to America earlier, or to Canada earlier, and had made room in the the house to let the other sister board with her, right? lot of us have that in our families. And then one sister who had gotten there earlier, right, had managed to have a job and was, able to provide and pay the rent, and they expected the newly arrived to eventually get on board with that program, and it didn't happen. So there was a tremendous kind of stress in the household. And so one wrote in to complain, and then the other one saw the letter in the Bintel Brief and was really insulted and said, well, now I'm going to write. And so they, so that's like one I remember. And then just to flash forward, in coming, on the heels of the high holidays, this is like in the 70s, a couple wrote in. They could not agree what synagogue to go to. And this is like the 70s. And what's the story? They're totally, Eastern European native, right? They're not Dogebrona. They weren't born in the United States. The husband wants to go to his shul, where all his landsmen are, where his townsfolk are, where he can feel comfortable with the nusach, with the tradition. And it's Orthodox. And the wife is like, enough, I'd like to go to an egalitarian, I'd like to sit next to you, I'd like to participate in the service, and they couldn't figure out what to do. So they wrote in the 70s.
What did the forward tell them? Do you remember?
It was like a classic forward kind of discuss amongst yourselves sort of situation, but offering compassion, offering understanding that, look, traditionally, we totally understand the fact that you want to be among Yiddish speakers in your shul, you want to be close to your Mama Lashon, but we also understand that times have moved on, and your wife wants to participate. This is a good thing. She's happy to be Jewish. She wants to really, feel that she's involved. So I think they were kind of like, maybe you can do one day, like shul hopping.
That's what I was going to say. That's
right?
why God invented 2 days of Rosh Hashanah.
We're not in Israel. We can do it that way, yeah.
So those are two that come to mind.
Well, so we
Thank
have
you
a
for
great question from the internet that I'm going to give you guys. We're going to do a Bintel Blitz. So, dear Bintel, my pediatrician recommends we expose our 11-month-old to as many high-risk allergens as possible to decrease her risk of allergies. Sounds smart. As luck would have it, shellfish is one of the top high-risk allergens. Do we prioritize our child's safety over kashrut and feed her shrimp?
Who's their pediatrician? I mean, that just seems like that seems a little ridiculous to me. I feel like to want to just expose, who gets told? I mean, my kids are too young or too old. That my pediatrician told me to feed my kid things that I didn't want to feed them, that culturally we didn't feed them in my house. I would consider that find something else to tell
Find
me.
a new pediatrician.
Right, find a new pediatrician, find something else to tell
That's
me.
the advice. Find a new pediatrician. By the way, if your baby's gonna keep kosher after, who cares if she's allergic to shrimp?
That's a good point too.
Also true. Yeah, I mean, our pediatrician told us what to not expose our kids to, yeah. So it does seem peculiar. I would at least get a second opinion.
Although I suppose under pikuach nefesh, maybe you could certainly break kashrut for pikuach nefesh,
Exactly.
right, to save a life.
Exactly, but this sounds like preventative pikuach nefesh, but I don't think it works that way.
And would there be an option to just rub the shrimp on your arm?
Good question. Yeah.
But maybe you tell your pediatrician I'm Jewish and we don't eat that kind of food.
Sure. Yeah. Good work. Audience member, if you can't hear us on Vimeo, we have a feisty advice giver in the front row here who says, tell your pediatrician we keep kosher.
I think you must have written for the Bintel Brief. I recognize that answer.
Proud first generation.
All right.
Great. Okay, here's another one. A member of the family has an addiction to shopping. She gets all these products she buys on the internet and returns some of them, but most of them she keeps and never uses. What kind of advice would you have for this person? And I think this is an interesting double-layered question because this person is asking, essentially, should I confront this person in my family? And then what should I tell her? How do I give this person advice? But I think we would start with do you get involved at all, right?
I guess the first question is, to what degree is it affecting the person who's writing?
Correct.
For example, are they storing it in your closet? then you can't record your podcast.
Or spending your money.
Right, or spending your money, exactly. If not, shopping addictions, if it's a true addiction, that's the real deal. That's a
That
real.
needs
I don't
actual
know that a lay person actually can intervene in a way that immediately solves the problem. I would suggest that if there is an opening to have a conversation, sure, but that would just be the first step on a longer path that the other person may or may not be willing or able to take.
And I'm impressed that they're returning some of the things.
That's right. That's a good point.
I thought this was written by my husband until I saw that she keeps and never uses, because I use my shit.
Exactly, me too. But I
not
do have a
using stuff
stack
that
of
never
things by the door that need to be returned that take me forever to return them. So I'm impressed and proud of her that she gets some of them out the door.
Yeah.
Returning Amazon purchases to Whole Foods is one of my very favorite activities, I have to say. Chana, what do you talk to the shopping addict? What do you do with the shopping addict?
I was trying to think of what would Khan do with that? I think that one would be more of a public, make it a public service in some way. Can you offer this to the community in some way?
The stuff she doesn't use.
The items that she's not
Let's
keeping.
give them to the local, whatever, the community
Well, it's
center.
The
both-
regifting.
Well, it's both the things that she's not using, right?
Right.
And the things that so there's the things need to be returned, and some of the things she uses, and so it's does she get rid of all the things, not just the ones she's not using? Because she's collecting a lot. I don't know.
Well, I think they would also, they sometimes did have kind of like a therapeutic model, right? We've heard a couple of those where they would sort of say, now you might want to have a quiet conversation with this person, not a hostile one. Don't be angry when you approach them, and try not to shame them. But
Yeah, they might be concerned as socialists about the capitalist nature of this shopper, and they might suggest a conversation and I think Lynn might suggest this too. What hole in your life are you trying to fill? But maybe you're saying that might be better for a therapist or an addiction specialist.
It could be part of a conversation that you
Initial
open.
yeah, exactly.
It's not a conversation that you can take responsibility for completing.
Another option would be to say, which of these items could I take off your hands for
There's
you?
that. There's that.
I think that's the OBCON. That's like giving it to the public. Give it back to the community. Yes.
Right. Are those shoes my size?
Perfect.
Looking around the room to see if you have a question here, please raise your hand, and Matt Littman will bring a microphone over to you. But for now, we'll go to our other question from the Vimeo audience. Hello, I'm hard of hearing and find Jewish organizations very resistant to being inclusive of people with disabilities, such as not providing captioning for web events. Please
Did we
tell
provide
me.
captioning
Please tell
for
me we have
this?
captioning. Okay.
Vimeo do it
Anyway.
automatically? I think
What?
Vimeo might have the function to do it. I'm not sure.
Right.
If we don't,
If you're
sorry,
watching the audience,
but we'll
check
give
your
it.
lower corner and see if there's a closed caption option.
Yeah.
We'll give ourselves some of this advice when we talk about this. The way she phrases this person phrases the question: how do I or we do better at being more inclusive? Although the second part I think is the real question: how can we get Jewish organizations to be more inclusive with those with disabilities?
Mm-hmm.
In other words, how can she effectively advocate for this cause for herself, etc.?
Just an anecdote, when we were at Shabbat morning services last week, and there was someone doing sign language interpreting, and I was shocked that it was the first time I'd ever seen that. It's because it seems like, of course, it was wonderful, it was beautiful, and I was so curious and interested watching him sign along to the songs, and whether they're in Hebrew or English, and just wondering what the process was. I was fascinated. But obviously, it shouldn't have been the first time.
Well, the first step also to inclusion is awareness, right? And knowing that your community is filled with people who have different abilities, different levels of comprehension, understanding, all sorts of diversity within and among ourselves. And so being able to communicate that to the institution that you're closest to, start closest to home, right? The person who answered the question or asked the question is talking about our Jewish institutions. Jewish institutions are not the only ones who are not good at this. It's a universal challenge that we haven't always been willing and able to see the full breadth and beauty and the diversity of our community. And if we can see that, we can provide the things that meet their needs.
Right, and you have to kind of show up and demand in a way.
Absolutely.
And put your own skin in the game about
Right.
it.
Well, that's where the awareness comes from. We have to know that we all exist. And I
Right.
think that folks who have been marginalized and felt like they couldn't access, did take a seat back and weren't as visible and weren't as present. And I think that's one really great thing about this era that we're in, is that sort of the democratization of information and stories and people and everyone being able to see it has opened up. Oh, wait a minute. We actually do have multiple people who are hard of hearing. We actually do have multiple people who are neurodiverse. We actually do have people who are who need more from us.
Right. I mean, I do think on this particular question, it's actually interesting the way that the pandemic and Zoom live stream era has a lot of hard of hearing or hearing impaired or deaf people I have heard from about how this has been the golden era for their Jewish engagement, because so many places actually have provided closed captioning, frankly, because it's easier and cheaper than hiring an interpreter for every program. And I think we ran an essay a while ago about a person who was terrified of going back because she had been so disappointed by the way her synagogue and other organizations had acted in person, and she was getting so much more out of her Jewish engaged life. I'd like to follow up with her and see.
And the same thing is true for kids in schools, too. So many kids who felt relief in not having to be in typical institutions and in the social challenges of being in schools and being able to actually focus on the learning.
It also makes me think of, this is not quite the same thing, but this sounds like a small thing, but it's a big thing, and I'd love to do some sort of culture change mapping, and that's how common and normal and default it is for clergy to say, please rise if you're able. And that, to me, it's the norm now, and it certainly wasn't the norm, I don't know how many, not very many years ago.
Not when I was growing up.
No, certainly not when I was growing up either. And so I'd be curious to know, was it one clergy person who said this is the right thing to do, or was it one synagogue who had one person come and advocate, like we're suggesting in this case, and one person who started doing it? And then there was, there were other clergy or other, synagogue members in that crowd that day who went back to their clergy and said, what you should say. I have no idea, but I'd love to know.
Should we ask the one you live with who's in the audience
Do you know,
right
David?
now?
How did that get started?
No, we're not going to ask him, but we love Rabbi David Adelson in the crowd tonight. Thank you. Okay, next question. Both my mother, this is one we are all going to relate to either in some way. Both my mother, who's 92, and my mother-in-law, who's 88, still drive. And neither of them should really be behind the wheel. They both value their independence.
Biggest laugh of the night so far.
And they think they drive fine.
Oh, boy.
They also drive other people who can't drive anymore. Wow. How do we gently tell them they shouldn't be driving and have them take our advice? My mother-in-law's mother had to be in an accident before she would give up her car. I don't want to wait for an accident.
Yep.
Help. So I think everybody here is either maybe wondering whether they should be driving, maybe wondering if their parents should be driving, maybe has a friend who they're wondering about. I don't know why, Lynn. I'm starting with you.
You're starting with
I'm sorry, Liz. I distinctly remember getting in my grandfather's Bonneville when I was a kid, and my mother being like, there they go. I'm not getting in the car with them. So, it's...
This reminds me, too, I think none of my family members are listening, so I'm just going to say it, which is, so we recently went on a multi-generational family vacation with my parents, who are in their 80s, but very healthy, and both still driving, and my nieces, nephews, and children, who are range in age from mine, who are 15 up to 23, 4. Anyway, apparently their generation had a big conversation about how good or bad all of us are at driving, including my generation. And there was a whole discussion.
Was there a ranking?
Oh, good question. I don't know.
A ranking.
I was like, anyway, and who they all drive. Most of them drive now, right? So they're very expert in telling us how well we drive. Anyway, how do you take the keys away from someone you love?
Yeah.
This is such an important symbol of that independence.
Yeah.
And these moments happen. You got to say.
Yeah, I mean, right, there's my first instinct is take the keys, hand them the phone with the Uber, but I think there needs to be kind of two approaches at once that are a little bit at odds, and one is the harm reduction and one is the compassion, right? So, you can do harm reduction, which is somehow literally figure out how to keep them from driving, because we know it is presumably it is actually potentially dangerous. At the same time, we know that I think of this with certainly our aging parents, that one of whom is definitely listening right now and is a pretty good driver.
You can guess which one you are.
I have to say, but have the conversation, about like we've my husband and I, and certainly our friends, have seen our parents who are aging, but and at the same time very thoughtful and articulate about how hard it is to lose certain freedoms either by choice or by necessity. And I just think there's a conversation to be had. Well, if you can't have this one freedom because it might be dangerous, what are some other ones that you can have? You could take up smoking. I don't know. But I just think there's a compassionate conversation to have.
I love because I get to put my little podcast hat on here, and I don't get to do this every day, but I'm thinking about your textual close reading here. And I think the key to this question is they also drive other people who can't drive anymore.
Yeah.
Because I think if you go to them and talk about their concern for their friends, maybe that's the way to make them see. They're trying to be so wonderful in helping friends who can't drive anymore, but really maybe they're putting them in danger. I wonder
But
if
those
that
friends
would
could
work.
also be like, wait a minute, that's my ride.
Yeah.
Like, hold on. I was going to, can we take them to the DMV and have,
Make it somebody else's decision.
there we go. Take them to the
like that.
DMV, we can call the DMV,
Take them to
make
the-
an appointment.
Being at the DNV might
Right.
go.
Then,
Like,
but what
you
about
know-
that? Abkahan would say we're publicly shaming them there, right?
No, there's no
I was actually thinking how they would start it. They would probably load. I think the forward would have answered this with a lot of statistics. They would start with data, and they would say, "Listen,
like
at
that.
this age, so many % accidents happen. This is a fact. Underscore. It's a fact. I'm not making it up, and it's not my personal vendetta against you.
Nice.
Let's."
I
But
like
that's
that.
why the DMV is important, because it's a third party.
Yeah.
And you take them to the DMV, and Carolyn behind the counter says, the likelihood of being in a fatal crash increases by X% every year after 75.
Right.
That's the
And
outcome.
someone else besides you is
Nice.
delivering that information.
Or you can hire someone to play that.
You could
person.
hire someone to play that role.
Or now, not all of us
I'm not
live in the
above it.
same. Not all of us live near our parents. Although, Lynn, you do.
I do.
Live near your in-laws. You live near your parents. Because you could, instead of trading the keys for the Uber, you could. I will drive you. I will spend all this more time with you. Maybe that's the answer. Easy for me to say, but okay.
I have
Okay.
played that role, so I'd be down for that.
Why is it that? Why is driving the thing? Why is that the thing?
It is the independence.
Independence.
One mention.
Okay, fine.
Is it the same thing? I mean,
already
is it
asked
the
dumb
snew thing for New
question.
Yorkers? I don't know, because it's driving isn't.
Right.
I grew up in Boston, and driving was definitely independence. But in New York, you don't need it as much. So I don't know if it's like your dad had no trouble giving up the car, as I recall. Right. So
By the way, we have 2 comments from Vivio about this question, not more questions. Someone named Lynn, not you, I assume,
that would be weird.
says, I asked my father's doctor to talk to him about stopping driving. Lynn from the DMV.
Good.
I asked my father's doctor to talk to him when he was about 95. My father, who is no longer living, was so angry he didn't talk to me for about 9 months.
Oh God.
Whoa.
So
High
that
stakes.
went well.
I mean, this is so, honest. Let's talk tactless here.
Yeah.
9 months of these last years, or the risk of your father dying in a car accident. I don't know.
It's not just your father. It's that they hit other people. That's
Right,
the other,
okay.
Yeah,
it's,
yeah,
Right.
it's a big deal.
Yeah.
But I mean, can you imagine not losing 9 months of those last years with your 95-year-old father? I mean,
Maybe you need to say in Judaism, life is sacred. Life is sacred for us, so we do not do anything that might harm another person.
right.
Nice.
Okay.
Stop.
Our
Judaism.
So we've got the doctor, the rabbi, and the DMV that can all
coming
provide
together.
third-party
And
validators
then
to this.
Barbara says, also on Vimeo, you won't understand until you have walked a mile in my 86-year-old shoes. I'd like to also
I see what you did there.
Yeah, I like that. I like that walking. And I want to just, while we're talking about shoes, Chana Pollack gave me the most amazing advice 2 weeks ago. I have arthritis in my feet, as loyal readers of my newsletter know, and she recommended these amazing shoes. They're called Hokas. I'm very into them.
Are they working out?
They are working out so
Nice.
far. So thank you for that advice. And which I want to ask you guys who you turn to for advice. You're the host of an advice podcast, but you have problems, you have issues, you have dilemmas. Who do you turn to?
Reader, I married him. Yep. That guy. Yeah. Seriously. Seriously. This is
What about when you have questions about him?
Ginna. An old friend of mine, I think we mentioned this on the podcast at some point. An old friend of mine, we were in the middle of a conversation where someone was trying to figure out if she should stay with this guy. And the question that my friend Julina asked in that moment, she said to the other person, do you feel like you want to run things by him? And I thought, what a great question. What a great kind of what a great litmus test. You know, do you feel like he's just gonna and run things by doesn't mean like, do you feel like he's always right? Or do you feel that you want him to make all of your decisions?
I think other people say also, is he the one you want to call? Are they the one you want to call when you have some news?
Yeah.
Good, bad, otherwise.
Right. And so, to your question, that is one thing that that has worked out for me.
Okay, Ginna, no pressure about your spouse. You can answer someone else.
Yeah.
Who do you turn to for advice?
I walked this question around my house a little bit, and my spouse did say me. You asked me, so I heard that, and I want to say I was thinking about it, and I was thinking that my mom is 88. We don't live in the same city. She lives in Jerusalem. I live here, and
Also not the same country.
Yeah, not in the same country. And recently, I have started, I don't know how, it just kind of comes out of me, and I start asking her, well, what do you think? Or I just pose that,
Oh my God.
And I want to suggest this because I think when your parent arrives at a certain age and you are at a certain age, it's kind of like the perfect moment because you need to be very mindful because every minute counts. And therefore, I suspend judgment and intolerance a little better than I ever have. And I think that she's just thrilled that I'm actually
Of course.
inquiring. So,
Yeah.
Ginna, I know you ask your 7-year-old daughter.
I do, absolutely. I was going to say that there's so much wisdom in children, and they're able to just sort of zoom out of an issue and really break it down. And so I've got 4 kids from 19 to 7, and I ask them all the time, what should I do? I need some help with this. Absolutely.
So we are almost out of time, but I am going to ask one more question. But first of all, if you have questions, whether you're here in the room or on Vimeo or listening to the podcast, because we're going to upload this to the podcast feed, please send them to our email, bintel@forward.com. That's BINTEL @forward.com. Or call Ginna.
Or call us.
Or call us at 201
201
Something
9628.
9728. Definitely 9728. Okay. And we want to thank again the JCC Manhattan, Rachel Fishman-Feddersen, Allie and Carmen, and Ed Blank.
Whose
you, Ed
generosity
Blank.
makes this program possible.
I messed that. We'd have to retake that one.
Yeah, let's go one more time. And Edward Blank.
Whose generosity makes this show possible.
Okay, one more question, and we'll try to do it in a Bintel Blitz. After more than, in fact, I might make this a yes or no question.
Ooh.
After more than 25 years of marriage to a non-Jew who my parents truly love, we are getting divorced. They are both old, hate change, and my father is very ill. I feel an obligation to share the reality of my situation with them, yet fear my father's heart cannot withstand the news. On a brighter note, I've fallen in love with a Jewish woman of appropriate age, who I'm sure they will adore. So it's a 2-part question. Should I let my dad die in peace? If not, which news should I lead with? Which I think is the easier of the two. But
Lead with the newbie.
Yep.
Lead with the I fall
Yeah.
in love. I'm going to be
Yeah.
happier.
Yeah,
in
yeah,
love.
yeah.
For sure. Anybody? No? Huh? Yes?
Yes.
If
Lead
you're
with
going
the
to
new
tell
one.
him,
Yeah.
start with the I've fallen in love with a Jewish woman of appropriate age, and I think you'll adore her. right?
Yeah.
Then take questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
It is unclear. The gender of the writer of this letter is unclear. So who knows if there's anything involving
But
gender.
they think that the dad will like the person no matter what. So
Yeah. It seems like they like the original
okay.
person. They also will like the future person. Okay, but do you tell them? Chana,
Do I tell him?
do you tell any of this, that this is going on to your dad who has a
Yes,
part?
100%. Yes.
Yes.
I want to know more. I want to know how bad is his heart? How close is he to
I fear
the
my
mouth?
father's heart cannot withstand the news.
Then I'm going to say no.
I would say no if it weren't for the coda.
That there's another person.
Right.
I wouldn't want, I mean, if this news could really be that devastating to him, what would be the reason for him knowing? Just to know?
Yeah, I think it's to share the simcha. I just think it's a byproduct of sharing the simcha.
But yes, so like
Yeah.
if there is a new, right, so lead with the new wife. If there wasn't a new wife or a new spouse, definitely don't tell him.
Simcha for who? The father or the woman?
Well, we need to get your name later to bring you onto the podcast.
I think, but he would be. I think that I'm assuming that the father will be happy to know the new news.
A 95-year-old father. His daughter's going to marry a daughter.
We
don't
don't
know.
even
We
know
don't
the
know.
gender. We don't
don't know
even know the
anything.
gender
We don't
of
know.
these people. We have no idea whether
doesn't
this
say.
has anything to do with same-sex couples.
No.
As I often say, I don't think the juice is worth the squeeze here. I just don't think it's
Too
worth
much
it.
risk.
Too much risk.
Too much risk.
If you really
Fair.
believe it.
But
I'm
I think,
skeptical.
but we think, how do you continue in this relationship without them knowing these huge changes in your life, right? That's what you think.
Yeah, you're gonna have to fake so much. It doesn't.
Well, so
Right.
I'm sort of splitting this up because I do think that with the new wife, so in the beginning I said lead with the new spouse, right?
Yeah.
If you've got that, if that weren't true, definitely would
Right.
not
Yeah, I
be
would.
worth telling.
We are out of time, although I want to do, if we can, one last quick thing, which is one of the great things if you sign up for the Bintel Brief newsletter. Sorry, you have a quick comment, or we don't have time for another question. Great. Can you use the microphone, please?
Yeah, if you're leading with the fact that there's a new happy love in your life, a new wife to be, isn't the father going to ask what happened to the?
Right.
Oh, right, we would.
You
Yeah,
can't
yeah,
get
you
around
would.
the bad
Exactly.
news.
Exactly.
You're
You can't-
totally right.
Yeah, I mean, his
It's a good
physical health
starter.
may be bad, but
That's how you do it, though. That's the good.
This is like, what's that old joke about the good news is you don't have cancer, but the bad news is you have Alzheimer's, and then they say, do I have cancer?
Right, yeah.
Anyway, one of the great special things that Lynn and Ginna do is we have a Bintel Brief newsletter for our super fans, and in that newsletter, they give us unsolicited advice. So I would love to hear a quick bit of unsolicited advice as we close out.
We were just talking about one for you. Oh, the red sponge.
Oh, yeah. It's not really. Okay, so for people who may have an abundance of oil production on their face, there's this magic product. It's a little red circular sponge. It's like $1 at CVS. It's a dream on the face. It looks as if you put on makeup or foundation when you use it. It's amazing.
We just saw this happen in real life, so it really worked.
There's no makeup on this face.
Cosign.
Right now.
What do you think?
Well, there's eye stuff. But
Got anything, Lynn?
Was sure.
advice?
For anyone who is who resents the patriarchy primarily because dresses have no pockets, my hack is that I have discovered that some bike shorts have pockets, so I wear the bike shorts with the pockets. By the way, these pants, for example, have no pockets.
fake
They're fake. There's nothing fake pockets. It's very silly. But in any case, bike shorts with pockets under the dress. Presto, pockets. You're welcome.
Nice. It seems awkward with the putting under.
Yeah,
but
is it-
okay.
It is, but they're there. At least you have your phone.
Like
You have
you're sort of
storage.
scratching
Yeah.
your butt a little bit, but okay.
It works.
Got anything?
a hack.
Unsolicited advice. Any
Unsolicited
unsolicited advice of any kind.
You know, it's food related, so judge me. But bamba, trust the Israeli.
Delicious.
Right?
Delicious.
Thank you. Nutritious.
Just
It's
bamba.
very hard to get away from snacking in this country. Bamba is like Anything
Okay, my unsolicited advice to close us out is going to surprise absolutely no one. It is to listen to the Bintel Brief, read the forward at forward.com, and support independent Jewish journalism. Thank you very much, everybody. It's been great to be with you. Have a good night.